How did it come to this? That was the question that I found myself asking for weeks. I sat in my recliner, kind of mindlessly staring at the TV, not really paying attention to what was on it or what was going on around me, really. Just wondering how in the world things got to this point. I wasn't sleeping. I was barely eating, which I know for me it kind of seems like a stretch. If I'm honest with you, I was depressed. I couldn't believe they had fired me. It's not like I was the first youth minister to ever be fired before, but most of the other colleagues that I had known of who had been fired from their churches had been fired for usually one of two reasons. Either there was a large moral failing, or they had just done something really, really dumb. But I hadn't done anything dumb. I'd worked hard. I did my best. I knew my kids. I thought the youth group was beginning to grow, and even though things had been frustrating for a while for me, I still felt like we had turned a corner and that things were starting to get better. And so when I walked in that morning and they had fired me, it just completely blindsided me. I felt like I, for the first time in my life, had failed. When I first got into ministry, I thought that because I love God and I love kids, that everything was just going to work out. But nobody had taught me about things like church politics or hidden agendas or hidden expectations. And they never taught me how personal just everything would feel. See, in most jobs, or at least in a lot of jobs, you can kind of go to work and you do your time and you do your job, and then you go home and you get to turn it off. But in ministry, you're pouring so much of yourself into it that it's hard to know what is the job and what's me. There's never a point where you really get to turn it off until you actually fall asleep. And then when you wake up, it's back on again. And it's easy to just take everything so very personally. And so when they fired me, it felt like they said to me, "You're not good enough. And that you don't belong in this realm. And that we don't think that you're a good fit." So as I sat in my chair in the church parsonage that I needed to be out of in a couple of weeks, I wondered, what's next? How am I going to recover from this? How is anything going to get better than what it is right now? But probably even more than that, even more than wondering, probably the question I wasn't ready to ask myself, at least out loud, but I was certainly thinking about it, was how could God let this happen to me? I realize now just how self-centered and how self-focused that is and how immature it was of me to ask that question of myself, but I can't deny the fact that I definitely asked myself, how could God allow this to happen? I'd given God everything. Like, I have made my professional career about leading other people to Him. And so how could God allow anyone who spends their life in service to Him to be hurt in such a deep and personal way? And I thought about a lot of the guys that I knew who were also who went to Johnson and were going for ministry and were trying to do that with their lives. And I thought about all the friends that I hung out with at Johnson, and every single one of us a ministry major. And yet here we were 5 years removed from graduation, and I would say that more than half of them were no longer in full-time vocational ministry because they had been through an incredibly painful experience, because their churches had just burned them in some way, shape, or form. And in fact, there were a few of them that didn't even consider themselves to be Christian anymore because of how deep that pain was for them. And so we asked ourselves, how could God let this happen to me? And it wasn't just that I was doubting my call to ministry. I was doubting my faith entirely. Because I felt that I'd been faithful to God, but right now it didn't feel like He was being faithful to me. I'm going to tell you something that you already know, but that, to be frank with you, I don't feel gets discussed enough in this type of setting or from this type of platform. And that's that sometimes faith is hard. Sometimes it's hard for us to have faith of any kind. It's difficult. If you really, can we be real here? Is that okay? I recognize I ask that a lot, but seriously, can we be hard? Or can we be difficult, have a painful conversation right now? Sometimes our faith doesn't make any sense. Right? We as Christians, we believe that there is a God that we cannot see, that we can't really hear audibly, that we, can't be around, but we believe that he's there and that he's working behind the scenes. And I mean, if we think about the whole notion of Jesus resurrecting from the dead, that's hard for us to buy into. I don't know about you, I've never seen a resurrection. And so sometimes our faith is just, it's hard. It's hard for us to get into. It's hard for people who are outside of faith to begin to believe in the first place. And sometimes it's hard for us as Christians even to have faith, let alone be faithful to God. And I think that we have this mindset. We've kind of bought into this notion that if I have doubt, then I'm a bad Christian. Or maybe I was never a Christian to begin with. But I'm going to be real with you. I don't think I've ever met a single Christian who has not in some way, shape, or form had doubts. I've met a lot of Christians who are really good about hiding it. A lot of Christians who put on that face like I'm the uber Christian and everything in my life is perfect and God is always with me, and other cliched lines that we use in church sometimes. But if we strip away that mask and if we strip away that and we get to what's real, every single one of us experiences times in our faith where we doubt, where we have trouble in our faith and we have trouble believing. It's universal of everyone in the world of faith that at some point in time, all of us experience doubt. And for most of us, I would say, those doubts really begin, or at least they're brought to light, when sometimes life is hard on us. When we go through a painful experience, when somebody that we love passes away, when life just kind of run us over, when we've been fired, when we just feel like we're at the period where we're just feeling low. Those doubts begin to creep in. They get brought to light, and it affects our faithfulness. We go through a period where it's natural for us to doubt God. And the worst part about that is that every single one of us goes through those periods in life. I'm convinced that every person who's living and breathing in this room right now either has, will have, or is currently going through a period where that life is just hard on us. Maybe you walked in this morning and you just kind of feel like a wrung out dish rag and you don't know how you're keeping to go. You wanted to stay home. It was hard getting out of bed this morning. But somehow you managed to pull yourself together enough to be here because you want to be faithful. And even though your faith is hard right now, and even though maybe somebody in this room has caused some of that pain to you, you still want to be faithful to God. It's one of those things that it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what your family is like, it doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account, life is going to be hard for us. And when that life gets hard, sometimes it's easy for us to doubt. When we experience these difficult or maybe even dark times in our lives, it makes us ask the question, where's God here? Where is God in this? Is God even there? Does he care? But we aren't the only ones who've ever experienced difficult times in our faith. And I got to be honest with you, this is one of the biggest reasons why I am so incredibly grateful that the story of Elijah made the book. Elijah was a prophet of God at a time when being a prophet or even a follower of God really was unpopular. Hardly anybody would proclaim God. In the nation of Israel, the nation that God started. They had reached a point now where God was kind of a dirty word. You didn't want to talk about him because everybody else was swinging this way. And they got to that way because of Ahab. Ahab was the king of Israel at this time, and he was an incredibly evil man. But as bad as Ahab was, Scripture tells us his wife Jezebel, she was worse. You maybe have been to the South or something like that, and you may have heard somebody describe a woman of ill repute as being, she's such a Jezebel. That's where that comes from. You're welcome. That's how evil that she was, is that still to this day, a woman who has got some bad morals, we consider her to be a Jezebel. And Ahab and Jezebel had kind of made it the popular thing amongst Israel to worship a false idol by the name of Baal. And it had gotten to the point where everybody in Israel seemed to be following after Baal and his teachings, and so Elijah felt very much alone. That he was the only person in an entire nation that still worshiped God. And so by the time we get to 1 Kings 19, Elijah's at his absolute lowest. He has hit rock bottom. And if we kind of read the chapter beforehand, if we read 1 Kings 18, we kind of wonder, how could Elijah possibly be this low? Because 1 Kings 18, God does something for Elijah that's just insane to think about. Right? So like we said, everybody in Israel is worshiping Baal. And Elijah seems to be the only person who's even remotely faithful to God. And Elijah goes in front of King Ahab, and he tells Ahab, hey, there's going to be a drought because you've led people astray. God has decided there's not going to be any rain. Because I don't know if you know this, but God is not really into this whole Baal worshiping fad. So God said, I'm going to make it stop raining. And because God said so, guess what? Stopped raining. 3 years. 3 years of no rain. That means that water supplies are getting scarce. That means that animals are probably dying off because they're not getting adequate water. That means that people might be dying off because there's nothing to replenish the water supply. And after 3 years, Elijah comes back to Ahab, and he kind of confronts Ahab and gives him a challenge. He says, I tell you what, you go and you get all the prophets of Baal and have them meet me on a mountain. And we're going to see who's God's real. And it's actually in this that Elijah gives us some indication of just how unpopular following God is. We see it in 1 Kings 18, verse 22. It says, then Elijah said to the people, I am the only remaining prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. That's a little lopsided, don't you think? There's 450 prophets of Baal, and then there's Elijah. And so Elijah's challenge is, let's go up on this mountain. We'll provide a sacrifice. We'll build an altar. We'll put some wood on it. We'll put a dead animal on top of it. But we're not going to be the ones who light the fire. Instead, we're going to call upon our various gods, and we're going to ask them to be the ones who light the fire, and whoever lights the fire must be the real God. And so Elijah, being the gentleman that he is, decides, you know what, you guys, I'm going to let you go first. And so they build their altar, they put the wood on top of it, they put the animal on it, and then 450 prophets of Baal begin shouting. Now, some of you have experienced this on some level, but I can shout pretty loud. And I like to think that there's 450 of them. That's quite a noise. 450 men all begin shouting, asking Baal to bring the fire. And nothing happens. That's embarrassing. They begin actually thinking, hey, maybe if we just cut ourselves, who immediately goes straight to let's cut ourselves? Maybe the smell of blood will be enough to have Baal know our sincerity, and he will send the fire. So 450 men just start bleeding and shouting. Still nothing. At this point, Elijah starts getting a little, humorous, I think. He keeps saying things like, well, maybe Baal's just asleep, and he's just a real sound sleeper. He can't hear you over his own snoring. And he even goes so far as to say, maybe Baal's using the facilities, and he can't come to the phone right now. That's hilarious to me. I don't know about you. But they shout even more, and still nothing. All that ends up happening is there's 450 really sore throats. And then Elijah says, okay, guys, it's my turn. And he builds his altar. He puts down stones, puts down 12 stones to symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel because, he likes a callback. Puts the wood on top of it, puts the animal on it. And then he says, you know what, this isn't good enough. Let's make this extra. I want them to make sure that they know that God is for real. And so he calls them to bring about these large basins of water. Now, I want to remind you, we're in a drought here. So water supplies are scarce anyway, and Elijah is saying, hey, get these huge jars of water and just start dumping them on there. I don't know if you know this either, but water and fire don't really like each other very much. And so Elijah gets to the point where everything is just saturated. There's pools of water around it. He dug a moat around it, which I think is cool. Like, I want a moat around my house one day. Sorry, that has nothing to do with anything. But he builds this little, reservoir, and the water is overfilling the reservoir, so everything is just completely saturated. And Elijah, I like to picture it like this. Elijah just kind of looks at it and goes, yeah, that's good enough. And then he takes a step back away from it and goes, you're up. And all of a sudden, like this huge ball of fire comes down, and it's so hot and so intense. Not only does it burn up the sacrifice, not only does it burn up the wood, it actually says it burns up the rock. I'm sorry, I think you didn't hear me. It burned up rock. There was a rock, now there's ash. I've never seen that before. That is an intense fire. And Elijah's feeling so confident in that moment that he orders to have all 450 prophets of Baal seized, and he kills them. They didn't tell you that in Sunday school class, did they? Elijah has just had a moment where there's absolutely no chance he could ever doubt God again, because God has just shown up for him in the biggest way possible. God showed up in a way that they still talk about today, because I'm talking about it right now. That's incredible. There's no chance that Elijah is ever going to doubt that God is on his side again, right? Not if you turn the page. Because in 1 Kings 19, Elijah's at a very low point. See, Ahab and Jezebel, they didn't really think that what Elijah did was cute. They're pretty unhappy about it. And Jezebel especially is so unhappy about it that she sends a little message to Elijah that basically tells him, not only are you going to die, I'm going to make sure it's really unpleasant for you. Now, again, to understand this, Elijah has just really ticked off the two most important people in the nation. These people command armies. And so Elijah has to run away. And he kind of flees and goes and tries to hide. He's feeling like, I'm the only man in Israel who's bothered to be faithful to God. I thought for sure that if we did this demonstration, then people would just come flocking back to you, but that's not what happened at all. Because the entire nation is against me. And so when Elijah finally gets to this place where he's leaving, having experienced this incredible moment with God, we can still kind of understand how he's at the point in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4, where he says, I've had enough. Lord, take my life, because I'm no better than my ancestors. Elijah's done. He has borne this weight for so long. He has felt this isolation for far too long in his life. He's been faithful to God, but what does he have to show for it? He's running for his life with nobody on his side, and it's just gotten to him. He tells God, I want to die. He doesn't just want to doubt God. He doesn't just want to give up his faith even. He wants to just end it all. Elijah has to be wondering, what is the point of being faithful when all it's gotten him is this hardship? And it's here, in this moment where Elijah's at his absolute lowest point ever, that God decides, I'm going to show up for him once again. He kind of compels Elijah to go and to hang out in this cave on the side of a mountain. And when Elijah eventually gets there, then God actually tells him what we read. And he says that God is going to, in first part of verse 11, it says that he said, go out, stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence. Understand the full weight of what Elijah has just been told here, what God has just told him. God has told him he's going to get to experience something that very few people have gotten a chance to experience. Elijah is about to physically stand in the presence of God. Well, there's no doubt that God is with him. Up to this point, I tried to think about it during the course of this week. The only person I could come up with that even got close to this was Moses. And God just showed him his backside, and it was so bad that Moses had to wear a veil the rest of his life. God is going to come and stand physically in the presence of Elijah. This is something you and I would just about give up our left arms for. I might even consider the right one. Because this is better than meeting any celebrity or any person of influence or anybody who's remotely important. This is God. And he's going to go and stand in his presence. And so Elijah gets out of the cave and he just kind of stands there at the entrance of the cave on this mountain. And I got to be real with you, I kind of wish I was just standing right next to Elijah for this next part because it is quite a show. And Elijah's got a front row seat to it. As Elijah's standing on the side of this mountain outside the entrance to this cave, this wind begins just whipping across. And it is such an intense wind that it is causing huge chunks of the mountain that Elijah is standing on to just break off and shatter into a million different pieces. This is unbelievably powerful. This is incredible. This has to be the presence of God, right? But the Lord was not in the wind. Okay. But as soon as the wind's done, an earthquake starts up. The ground underneath Elijah's feet begins to rumble and move, and everything feels like it's just, full on shaky. Right? And if I'm Elijah, I'm starting to wonder, why did I go on this mountain? Parts of it just fell off. Now the whole thing's moving. What's going on here? This has to be God's handiwork, right? This has to be God demonstrating his presence through this incredible earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Finally, there's a great fire. Now this has got to be it, right? I mean, if we go back and we look at Scripture before this point, excuse me, God has oftentimes used fire to symbolize his presence among his people. I mean, he spoke to Moses through a burning bush, right? Whenever they led the Israelites out of Egypt, he did so by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And I mean, for crying out loud, Elijah just a couple days ago saw a huge fire that symbolized God is with me. So this has to be God, right? This is fire. This is God. This is Scripture. This makes perfect sense. But the Lord was not in the fire. Whew, bummer. 3 ways that God could have shown himself. 3 ways that would make perfect sense to every single one of us and Elijah himself for God to reveal his presence to him. But he hasn't yet. It's after all of this, though. It's after this wind, after this earthquake, after this fire, that God shows his presence to Elijah. And he does it in such a small way, which feels so out of character for God. It says, after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. Here it is. This is the presence of God making itself known to Elijah in a soft whisper, something that's so small that it's so easy to miss. Everything that was before this would have made sense. And yet when Elijah's at his lowest point ever, and God says, I'm going to reveal my presence to you, he doesn't do it in some big and elaborate and booming way. He does it through a soft whisper. And when he does so, it begins a conversation between God and Elijah. And God basically tells Elijah, here's what's going to happen next. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what's going to take place in the next couple of days. But it's while God is explaining all of this to Elijah that God reveals something to Elijah that I think Elijah needed to hear. Something that Elijah needed to know from God. And I don't think God did it just as an aside. I don't think God did it as an, oh, by the way. I think God fully intended for Elijah to hear this part because he knew this is what Elijah needs right now. We see it in verse 18. God says, but I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. While God is explaining to Elijah what's going to happen next, God makes sure to mention there are 7,000 people who remain faithful to me. Can you imagine the kind of comfort this had to be for Elijah right now? Elijah has spent years believing that it's just him and God. He is the only one who's remained faithful, that the entire nation of Israel has turned away from God, and God is telling him that's not the case. Because there's not just one or two, but 7,000 people who have remained faithful just as you have. Elijah, you are not alone. After years of feeling that isolation and years of feeling that loneliness, Elijah's just been told, there's a whole army of people who got your back. Can you imagine just the relief that must have been on the heart of Elijah to just be able to let that go? To know that I'm not carrying this weight by myself, to know that God has not abandoned me and that other people have not abandoned God. There are more just like me. And after this experience with God, Elijah is a changed man. His passion is renewed. His faithfulness is back on fire. And he even goes so far as to go and confront Ahab again. And when he does so, he tells Ahab, hey, not only are you going to die, but here's how. And here's how you're going to be treated in your death. Nobody's going to remember you. He even goes so far as to say, dogs are going to come and lick up your blood when you die. Gross, but that is the kind of confidence that only comes from having a passion renewed, from having a faithfulness renewed, and it happens in this experience with God when Elijah took himself away from the problems, took himself away from the situations and the bad things, and listened for a soft whisper of God saying, I'm still with you. I don't know about you, but I know that for myself, I've been where Elijah was. I've been in that place where everything feels so incredibly dark and everything just feels so bad that there's just no chance it's ever going to get better. Times where my doubt and my pain feel so great that I wonder what the point of following God is in the first place. Again, I think almost all of us go through those times of doubt, those times where it just feels so big. That's insurmountable, that it's unconquerable, that there's no chance we're ever going to see a light at the end of this tunnel. We experience painful moments in our lives. We have those times where we wonder if God is even with us. And it's in these painful experiences that our faithfulness seems impossible, at the very least difficult. It's something every single one of us experience on some level. And folks, I got to tell you, it feels so natural to want to walk away. We have something that's so painful or so hurtful, it doesn't just make us question our faith. It doesn't even just make us question our faithfulness. It makes us question everything. Everything we thought we knew about God. And the truth is that for a lot of people, these moments tend to make them walk away from their faith. I can't tell you the amount of stories I've heard from people who have been hurt, who've had so much pain. Sometimes that pain is caused by the church itself. And it was so deep, so painful for them, that it not only made them question their faithfulness, it made them walk away from their faith entirely. But I want to ask a question. What if we chose a different path? What if we chose a different notion? What if we chose to do something that in the moment might seem like foolishness? What if instead of walking away from God when those times of pain and doubt and hurt are just so big, what if instead of walking away from Him, instead we chose to run towards Him? See, Elijah is ready to give it all up when God told him, get away. Physically remove yourself from that situation. We're going to have a little one-on-one time. So Elijah gets away. He takes a step back from that situation. I think that's, to be honest with you, I think that's probably the most important part of this story. That Elijah, when everything was at its darkest and he's ready to give it all up, separates himself from the situation, separates himself and just gets some time alone with God. What if we did that? What if instead of letting these situations allow us to experience this doubt to the point that we're questioning everything, where it doesn't just wreck our faithfulness, but could wreck our faith entirely? What if instead we decided to just take a moment and remove ourselves, maybe physically, and spend some time one-on-one with God? I think that part of the reason why times where doubt, or where we doubt the direction that God is taking us, or whether he's being faithful to us, the way that these crush our faithfulness is because we allow it. We don't give ourselves the time to break away from it. I want to let you know something, and I don't think anybody's ever told you this before. Or if they had, maybe you missed it and you need to be reminded. It is not a weakness to need a break. It's not a weakness to need a break. It's something all of us need. A time to just step away, to get that alone time with God, to just press pause on everything and just get away with God. I mean, for crying out loud, Jesus needed it. The Son of God, the Emmanuel, knew the importance of breaking away, pushing pause on everything to spend some time to refocus and reconnect and recenter himself with God. And he knew it pretty early on, because Mark chapter 1 verse 35 actually tells us very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up, he went out, and he made his way to a deserted place, and there was praying. I mean, the night before the cross, the night before the whole reason Jesus was sent to earth in the first place, what does he do? He takes some time. He goes into the garden by himself. I mean, he brought the disciples, but he had them go wait over there so he could have some time by himself to reconnect with God, to rekindle that faithfulness, to give him the strength for what he had to do. If Jesus needed to take a break from time to time, what makes you think you don't? If the Son of God needed to have times in his life where he needed to just step away and spend some time with God so that he could renew his faithfulness, so that he could reconnect with God, so he could remain faithful to the call that God had for his life, what makes you think you don't? There is nothing wrong with needing to press pause and separate yourself, to have that time with God, to listen for that gentle whisper. Because I think so oftentimes when we have those moments of doubt, we have those moments of pain, and we have those moments where our faithfulness and our faith are tested, we're waiting for God to just part the heavens and shine a beam of light directly on us and speak to us in perfect King James and tell us, everythingeth shall beeth okayeth. When God is whispering to us. How many times have we missed that? How many times have we missed the voice of God wanting to speak something into us to reignite that spark, to spur us on to remain faithful? How many times have we missed that? Because we allowed all of the loud voices that are in our world to overshadow it. We've allowed so many different things to influence us and speak to us and tell us their version of the truth, and they're screaming at us. Is it any wonder we miss the whisper of God? Elijah needed to take some time off. He needed to step away for God to speak the truth that he needed to hear. I believe that sometimes the most important thing that we can do is to stop everything and really listen for that whisper of God that comes to us from the Holy Spirit. That if we want to stay faithful, if we want to see the fruit of faithfulness in our lives, that's sometimes the most important thing that we can do is to step away, to go climb a mountain, sit at the entrance of a cave, and listen for the whisper of God, and allow him to speak to us. Because maybe God is whispering to us why he's allowing these situations to happen. Maybe God is whispering to us the lesson that we need to learn here. Or maybe, and maybe most importantly, God is just whispering to us to remind us, I'm still with you. You're not alone. I'm still here. But how can we possibly hear it if we're not really listening for it? I think one of the biggest reasons we struggle in our faithfulness is because we don't allow ourselves those times to disconnect, to just unplug everything and reconnect with God. We think that we've got to solve it first before we can come to God. We've got to get past this before we can come back to God. Can I let you in on a secret? Your problems will still be there when you get back down the mountain. They will. See, Elijah eventually had to come back down the mountain. But like I said, man, when he comes down that mountain, he's completely different. And he's not only ready to just confront his problems, he's ready to just tackle them and destroy them because he knows God's got my back. Because he took that time to separate that. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is go climb a mountain. You're going to have to come down the mountain at some point in time. But man, I think once you do, your faithfulness will be completely renewed. And your ability to handle these situations and this pain and this hurt is going to be so much greater because you know, I've just heard from God. And it didn't come in an earthquake, and it didn't come in a wind, and it didn't come in a fire. It came in a whisper, but that's all I needed. Yeah, you're going to have to come down the mountain at some point in time, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't climb it. Take those moments. Because even when things are at their bleakest and it feels like we've not just lost our faithfulness, but maybe even our faith itself, we can trust that God is still with us because his word tells us that. He spoke through Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, where he says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. And maybe the most important thing that we can do to see the fruit of faithfulness in our lives is to just stop. Take a step back. Climb a mountain. And listen for the whisper of God that comes from the Holy Spirit. I think he's trying to tell us something. If we can do that, I think that even in the darkest of times, we'll still see the fruit of faithfulness in our lives.